I'm joined now with, I guess, a familiar face to you. You've seen Nigel already, but also Sally Goble and Jo Crossick. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Nigel, obviously you've been on before, but I think we have more viewers on the stream now. So for the benefit of those people, who are you? Where'd you come from?
Hey, so Nigel Kersten, I'm field CTO at Puppet. So I'm essentially the CTO of the services customer success side. I work on a lot of large scale implementations. Joined Puppet quite a long time ago, just over 10 years now. My background was, before that, I was an SRE at Google, so lots of large scale operations.
Great. And Sally?
Hi, I'm Sally Goble. I'm an engineering manager at Attest. We're a relatively small startup of around 150 people. Before that, I was at Deliveroo as an engineering manager, the company of about 2,500. And basically there I was on the kind of the painful end of kind of a fast-growing startup, and now I'm at the kind of start of that process and hoping not to make some of the mistakes again that we had made at Deliveroo.
Great. And Jo?
Hi, I'm an engineering manager at Fundaps. It's a bootstrapped regtech startup. We've currently got about 20 some engineers, and I've only been there for a few weeks. Before Fundaps, I was at a company called And Digital, where I came in as employee number 25 and left 5-ish years later with over 500 people in the company. So saw really rapid growth there.
Great, thanks, Jo. Let's stick with you for a second. Then that's quite a lot of growth. What are the things that were the most painful for you in that period of time?
Hiring, keeping track, keeping the flow of people coming into the company to meet the growth ambitions was really hard. And there was always a tension between getting enough people in while keeping the standards high enough. I'm not sure that there is ever a kind of a black and white answer to that. And as a diversity and inclusion advocate, I would kind of say taking a risk on your hiring is a really nice thing to be able to do, to be able to take people in that don't necessarily fit the kind of the classic profile of you know what you may think a tech person looks like.
Yeah. You were about to say something else there. Sorry, no, go on.
Yeah, but it is a very competitive marketplace, and it's hard finding good people.
Yeah. So Nigel, you're nodding along there. You've got a first name at email address at Puppet, so you've obviously been there quite a while. What sort of growth have you seen there, and do you kind of did you see the hiring problem as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Puppet was, under 10 people when I joined, and we sort of went over 550 and then dropped down a bit again as we sort of slimmed down at one point. Onboarding and hiring is so hard. And I really like that point you made about the risk and taking it on people, because I think one of the things I've noticed, startup environments are different to big companies. And sometimes you feel like you're at a certain point where you're like, I just need to hire someone who's experienced, who's done this before. And they'll come from a much bigger organization, but they might be entirely unsuited to working at the sort of pace and chaos and sort of cross-functional way that you have to in a startup. And many of the very best people from the early days of Puppet who are still with the company or hit escape velocity and left were people from very non-traditional backgrounds. And so I think, ultimately I ended up resting on hiring on sort of behavioral characteristics, like really thinking about what are the behaviors and sort of the way people think, the way they approach problems, much more so than experience. And, in senior roles, it is really useful to have that experience, but it's such a balance. But yeah, if you can't grow diverse candidates at a startup, where can you?
Yeah, entirely fair. Sally, you mentioned that you came into Deliveroo sort of at the end of that scaling journey. So presumably you got to see the results of maybe some of these problems that had happened earlier on. Was any of the sort of characteristics of Deliveroo at that point informed by things that had gone on in the hiring earlier on, and were any of those sort of problems that you could now, with hindsight, look back and solve?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think one of those was hiring engineers before you have engineering managers. And fortunately, I was kind of brought in as one of those people to help solve that problem, because it's really easy to hire less senior engineers, right? It's very, very easy. It's harder still to hire senior engineers than enough senior engineers. And then in the process of doing that, you forget entirely that you have to kind of hire engineering managers to kind of cope with that scale. And I think we kind of got to a stage at Deliveroo where we kind of hired all the engineers we wanted, but we suddenly realised we kind of we hadn't managed to scale our engineering manager hiring at the same pace as our engineering hiring, and then you've got a problem, right? And the what we had to do there is stop hiring engineers. We just had to kind of basically put a freeze on hiring engineers in order to kind of move all of our recruitment team over to the process of hiring engineering managers, so we could kind of then kind of move on again. So you kind of have the kind of stop process where you've hired all your junior engineers, and then, oh my God, you've got to stop hiring junior engineers because you've skewed your team. Then you've got to hire your senior engineers, and then you've got to stop and then hire your engineering managers and go back to the kind of same process all over again. So trying to kind of keep those different tracks kind of at the same kind of pace of one another, I think, is a really important part of it for hiring.
Yeah, it's a real. My background was engineering, but I now run a business, and I think in the sort of shift from being a hands-on tech person to being someone who's much more kind of making decisions and moving the pieces around, it's been amazing to me to realize how much you just have to keep investing time and energy into making those changes and kind of shaping the organization as it grows. You can't just sort of go, right, here's what we're doing and leave it to run, because then it all goes horribly wrong. What are the things, or how did the problems manifest? Like when you had an engineering heavy organization without enough management, what did that look like as far as kind of, I don't know, the outcomes that you cared about? How were they impaired?
Well, nobody has any time. None of your engineers have any time invested on them from an engineering manager point of view, do they? So you have nobody to kind of look after your growth. You have nobody to turn to if you're having a problem. Kind of the teams don't run as efficiently, and you have engineering managers who can, are managing, many more people than they can kind of cope with. So all of the things, all of the kind of hygiene things that you would think that you would want to do, like career progression, you just can't do anymore. So your engineers are just doing delivery and nothing else. They're not being rewarded for it. They're not being promoted. They're not being nurtured. So you kind of create a whole number of other problems, and then the engineering managers you have burn out, can't do their jobs well enough, and then you have an even bigger problem. So I think it's a kind of really crucial part of it. And then another thing which kind of I think touches on Nigel's point is that you need to have those people, your engineers, grow with the company. And that's a really difficult thing, actually. When you're a senior engineer in a company that's, and people talk to you as though you're a senior engineer in a company of 20 people, it's very different than being a senior engineer in a company of 500. How do you keep those people kind of leveling up and growing with the company? And if you don't have kind of managers who can do that and don't invest time in them, those people are going to fall by the wayside.
Yeah. Nigel, are these problems that you saw at Puppet as well, or were you able to sort of mitigate those on the way through?
We made all these mistakes, and I think a few extra ones as well. I think it's really important that you recognize that you need to give career growth to people that you've hired, especially in the individual practitioner sort of job ladder. And to sort of, I guess this relates to a few of the points we've talked about, which is, if you don't make it really clear to people in the organization that you can have a path as an engineer that will be just as well compensated as jumping to the management track, you'll end up finding that many of your most ambitious engineers who are really good at computers are suddenly pushing to get jobs where they're managing people instead. And some make that transition, but you've got to make sure, I think it's really important that you've got to make it clear to folks pretty early with career ladders or just people who are an example of this, that you can progress your career without jumping to management, and management's not a promotion from engineering, it's a sideways move.
Yeah, for sure. Nigel, can you, I guess, give me a sense of what you think of as the things that a senior engineer should be doing over and above an engineer, and maybe how that differs from engineering manager? Where are the lines drawn, at least as far as Puppet is concerned?
Yeah, well, I think as you rise up in the engineering individual contributor track, you start taking on mentoring junior engineers, like in terms of technical practices and those sort of things. So you start taking sort of care of the team rather than just care of the work. And I think that's distinct from a manager's sort of care and nurturing of the team. It's more technical practices, technical leading, that sort of thing. I think as you rise up too, you should be expected to reach across org boundaries, to sort of return to the thing I was talking about earlier today, which is you should have peers in other teams as you get different teams working on different aspects of the product. Your senior engineers should be communicating horizontally across the organization and sort of building those sorts of bridges and ensuring sort of a level of consistency and what I think of as engineering taste. Like what's the aesthetic for how you build things and the way you approach these problems and the way you solve them. But I think your job also becomes to sort of push back a little bit on the work that's being handed to you and go, I need this more clearly defined. Like, we would like to take this opportunity to write down some technical debt. Like, if you really want us to do us on this timeline, these are the trade-offs you're going to be facing further down the track. So I think it becomes about communicating outwards as much as the work itself.
Yeah, there's sort of advocacy for yourself and your sort of group of people against the face of the power dynamic of you need to be doing these things by this time.
Yeah.
Cool. Jo, I guess Nigel and Sally are both from product business backgrounds, I guess, in the sort of traditional sense. I know your previous employer was a consultancy, and I mean my experience is consultancy as well. Talk about the challenges of, I guess, growing your team and growing a team culture when they're actually spending most of their time working for other people. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have a bunch of people who are all working in different places and in different environments, and it can be quite inconsistent, it's all the more important to take maximum advantage of the levers that you can pull. At Digital, we had a very strong, rigorous onboarding process that almost amounted to indoctrination. But the importance of embedding our cultural values in those people in a really solid way when they came on board was incredibly important and incredibly effective as well. People are very malleable when they're changing companies. They don't have such preconceived ideas. They're mentally open for new ideas, and they've got curiosity about how things should be done. So if you have a very strong onboarding process, then you can really take advantage of that to set good habits early. We also used a lot of soft culture, communities of practice and social communities as well to kind of bring people back home, not just physically, but like emotionally and with social connection as well, so that they felt like they were part of And Digital, not just the client that they were on. But it's something that as a manager, you have to also very carefully watch in each of the people that you look after. Like, what are the signs that they're losing engagement, that they're not staying rooted in the sort of the values and the culture that you want to promote as a company.
Yeah. Sally, cultural definition. How do you define culture in your organisation? How do you, I guess, impart that or share it? And as you grow, how are you doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really difficult. It's like keeping that culture as you grow. And I think, Jane, when I heard you talking about that, I was thinking actually it's quite similar when you have a kind of a large tech organization that's grown, and you end up like having like lots of kind of little different companies and cultures, don't you? I think, and that's one of the beauties of having a small company, is you can kind of keep the culture fairly tight because everybody's talking to each other all the time. It's super easy to kind of communicate your values and kind of keep your values up and you'll keep your culture up, because literally everybody's kind of intermingling with everybody else all the time. So it's not a difficult thing to kind of encourage. And also it's easy not to have silos. So that's super easy when you're small. When you grow, you kind of tend to have teams that then suddenly start kind of breeding their own cultures, and some for the better and some for the worse, right? And I guess trying to kind of, as a kind of an engineering leader, trying to kind of identify the kind of good kind of cultural practices within a team and kind of spread them across the organization organically is a kind of challenge that I'm not sure I know the answer to, actually.
Yeah, Nigel, your experience of this stuff also, I guess, has time zone and geographical implications. Like, how do you maintain a company culture in an organisation the size of Puppet when you've got offices in Portland and Belfast and wherever in Australia you have offices? Like, how does that work?
No, absolutely. When we started, we were all co-located in Portland, and Luke, the founder, very much had this sort of vision of he was sort of somewhat anti-remote work at that point because he was trying to grow a very deliberate culture. And there's things you can do when you're 50 people who all go to the same office every day that become really difficult. We then opened up our Belfast office, and as the sort of resident, senior non-American within the company who was based in America at the time, suddenly finding myself in the position of having to explain the casual swearing of the Irish to the Americans who were very West Coast tech culture, somewhat offended by you don't say that on a video call, was pretty interesting. But we really noticed, I think it's, the Dunbar number's like 150. It's supposed to be the number of meaningful social connections any individual can keep in their head. I really noticed 150 to 200 was the sort of where it felt like everything suddenly changed. Culture, and however you define culture, social interactions, communication patterns, norms of behavior, they weren't a thing you really had to focus on because you were small enough, everyone just mimicked each other. And I remember going away on a couple of week business trip, coming back and suddenly realizing not only were people there who I didn't even know their roles were advertised, but they themselves had hired more people in those couple of weeks. And suddenly you're like, wow, we're now 250 rather than 150. And that world is completely different. So, but I think the point about separate little cultures do form is both you want teams to have an identity, but you also don't want them to be swimming upstream against the larger sort of kind of environment you're trying to create.
And I guess you don't want to encourage those teams to become sort of tribal in as far as their interactions with each other. You want it to be sort of one big in group rather than multiple sort of in and out groups.
Absolutely. And one of the things, I think one of the lessons I learned at Google really quickly on that was that they rotated people amongst teams and services quite brutally. If you spent more than a year and a half working on a particular service, you were just forced to move on to a different service. And
is that because the service had been deprecated, or
I was waiting for that line. Yes,
Google Reader, man.
I think this is a really interesting point about moving people on, actually, as kind of engineering leaders. I think because very rarely you find that kind of engineering leadership move on. And I think that discourages other people from moving on. So, I've worked in companies where, you have a kind of an engineering leader, they work in a team, they know that team really well, and they kind of stay where they are. And then what chance have you got of encouraging your kind of engineers to move around if your kind of leadership don't do that as well? So I'm a kind of a strong advocate of having leaders who also kind of move from kind of team to team to team as well. That might be a controversial point of view.
No, I think that's really good. To jump on that a little, I think it forces certain other behaviors. Your team managers should get to move from team to team because I think it's good to refresh. But it means you also do need sort of HR systems around things like, where do you keep track of, the 6 monthly career check-ins and the individual employees' goals? Because some of the most frustrated and upset good engineers that I've ever had working for me were the ones who are like, I've had 5 managers in 2 years. No one ever gives me the things I'm looking for in my career because every 6 months I have to explain this all over again.
Yeah.
There seems to be certainly in the bigger consultancies. I believe this is an Accenture thing. It may well be true elsewhere that they maintain this kind of idea where you sort of a percentage of the organisation has to go up into a sort of leadership position or leave. Like they need to make room at the bottom for new talent, and so there's a sort of enforced. You have to go through some kind of hierarchy or not be there. Would you say that would answer the same sorts of questions, or does that add an entirely contrary dynamic? Maybe Jo, you could answer that from your. I imagine And Digital didn't do that.
Yeah, no, we didn't. And you know, the benefit and the challenge both of being in the tech industry, where you know average length of service is somewhere around 2 years, 3 months, or something ridiculous like that. We did always have a certain amount of churn at all levels, and we tried very much to see that as not a good thing nor a bad thing. There was an optimal amount of churn because you did need to give opportunity for people to move up. Now, being in a really rapidly growing company, like, it's not a case of making space for people to move up so much as not ending up pushing people up too quickly because you can't find anybody else to do the job. So I think that's not really a problem that we saw at all. But to kind of to take those opportunities to use your up and coming stars in the company to give them the opportunity to grow, but also to leverage their experience and invested knowledge in the company to seed that into new areas of the company was definitely something we took advantage of. The challenge there is, how do you make sure that those very talented people who are very good at what they do are also being given the right amount of support so that they don't end up, you know, with the kind of end up floundering without support in their new roles as you're giving those opportunities.
Yep. I guess a little comment from the chat. Dave saying, find that churn leads to bike shedding. New people on the team always want to reinvent things needlessly. That to me suggests a kind of you don't have a good corporate memory, like you don't have this sort of understanding of the things that you've tried and thrown away already, which I think leads on to another topic I wanted to get into, which was I guess sharing knowledge, sharing context, communicating that stuff, making sure that information is available to newcomers and the existing team alike. Sally, maybe you talk about the challenges of communication as a business grows.
I think there are many challenges of communication as business grows. The first of which is, you know, everything starts off informal, doesn't it? And that's super easy to do. You know, you have a kind of small system. Everybody was there from the start. You know, everybody knows everything about everything. And then as you grow, those challenges become greater in terms of engineers. Like, you need to start documenting things. How much documentation is enough? How much is too much? How much, you know, how quickly does that documentation become out of date and useless? That's kind of one thing. So kind of challenging of documentation, challenges of just like everybody knowing everything about the company, right? So you start off, you know everything, not only about, you know, the kind of code base that you're working on, about what the product is, how big the product is, how do you kind of scale that, right? Do you need to scale? Does everybody need to know everything about the company? I don't think you can ever over communicate enough, is the bottom line of this. I think both informally and formally, I think there's a lot that is not done around, I guess, kind of formal learning. And I think this is something that I'm really interestingly struggling with in the company at the moment, is that everybody has spent so much time informally teaching one another things that I've been kind of slightly mystified as to why there are no tech talks and lunch and learns and things like that. And it suddenly occurred to me, like, oh, people don't need to do that because they've already always done it one-to-one. But now that we're scaling, nobody's had any sense that they need to start doing that kind of more formally. So I think kind of very consciously putting in those mechanisms where people start to kind of address more formal, many different ways of formally communicating with one another. And then there's the other side of it, which is management not knowing what's going on. There's kind of engineers not knowing what's going on, but there's also management not knowing what their engineers are doing as well, or kind of senior management not knowing what their engineers are doing and feeling like they need to keep knowing what they're doing. So kind of losing kind of slight control of what the team are doing and kind of managing the kind of that kind of expectation is a really super interesting challenge as well.
Yeah. Nigel, I guess you've seen that sort of thing evolve at Puppet. But, I mean, this is something that I kind of have an eye on myself, where today there's a lot of stuff that happens in the company that I don't know about, and actually it's probably for the best that I don't, because that's not operating at a level that I should care about as a CEO. Talk to me about how Puppet scaled that challenge, I suppose.
Well, I think, there's been bits that were good and bits that were bad. I would say, documenting matters, but I think, talking to friends at other companies that went through similar growth trajectories, you sort of got to work out what kind of a communication culture you are. Like, are you an email culture? Are you a written document culture? Are you a wiki that people actually attempt to keep up to date and manage to work out how to search? You've sort of got to settle on somewhere that the ancestral knowledge actually sort of lives in. I found one of the things I found really interesting, I think, to get to your direct question, was you get to a point where you go, okay, there are now people doing these jobs and they're doing their jobs and we've got an appropriate interface and I feel like the communication's flowing. Everything's great. I no longer have to care about this. I just see great outcomes. And then something goes wrong. And I know, like, I fell victim to this, where you're just like, your tendency is to just swoop because you've been there before. You're reasonably familiar with fixing a disaster in that particular area. But you've got to really force yourself to sit back. And I noticed that, we saw this at all sorts of levels of management, and someone more experienced who was more senior than me at one point, I was sort of complaining to them in a one-on-one session about something. They were like, I just need you to be really clear. Are you venting, giving me information, or asking me to do something? And I think working out how to get into those sort of rhythms of going, for this person, when they talk to me, be really clear. Are you asking me to do something, or am I just here to listen? Because listening is actually also super important. It's part of the fabric that keeps everyone well bonded. And sometimes you don't have to do anything. You just need to hear them complain for a while.
Yeah, we've just started a leadership study group in our place, where we kind of look at a short piece of text about leadership that maybe sums up a larger piece of writing as a sort of starting point for further sort of inquiry. And we looked last time at the David Marquet stuff around leadership, so leading by asking questions rather than giving instructions. And I think the thing that came out of that discussion was that people felt that they didn't have the time to help somebody go through the learning and responding themselves, and so you're sort of very inclined to jump in with a solution, whereas actually the spending maybe twice, 4 times as long to help someone get to the solution themselves is more beneficial, because you're prioritizing their learning as well. And that's something that I think we're going to have to unprogram for ourselves to an extent, because that is definitely a mindset that we've been in. If you have any hints on how to do that, I would love to hear that. But I think it's just about being aware when you're doing it.
Would be, there's a lot of frameworks out there, whether you go through that you do try and develop people, the colors frameworks, are you communicate, all sorts of corporate astrology, as I often sort of think about these things. And in many ways, I don't think it matters that much what's in the frameworks. It's putting cohorts of people together through these systems to give them a common vocabulary to talk about things. So I think doing the community of practice style idea that you're talking about works really well. But I've also seen it be really successful just taking groups of managers who are all hired in the same 6-month period to just go and spend a week thinking about their job according to some framework. And the framework itself doesn't matter anywhere near as much as the fact that those people then become peers and have the same vocabulary. Eric Sorensen from Puppet talked a lot about how when he became manager at who did the Danger, that they took every manager in the whole company through training at the same time, and that it had this huge multiplying effect in terms of managers understanding how the other managers manage their teams and having a common vocabulary.
Yeah.
There's also So there's some great content from Jason Wong on developing a first team mindset, where your leaders create a team of leaders and their first responsibility is to each other. And if your leaders are looking after each other, then actually the trickle down effect of how looked after everybody else feels is multiplied. And it's a really nice way of kind of practicing a little bit of self-care as a manager.
Yep, which I think we often have to remember to do, right? Quite difficult. Sally, any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say a similar thing for hiring engineers at scale as well, actually, isn't it? I was very lucky at Test when I started, in fact, that I started on the same day as the other engineering manager. And so we have genuinely had kind of a process of like becoming managers and kind of becoming a kind of coherent team. Been really, really lucky. And I think it's kind of good practice when you're kind of scaling a team to bring people in cohorts, because kind of they can more effectively learn together. And we practice that at Deliveroo. And of course, it kind of makes much more sense when you're kind of hiring many people in terms of kind of business to kind of hire people in batches rather than kind of bringing, disrupting and bringing, starting a different person every day. I mean, that's maybe super obvious, but bringing them in kind of cohorts where they can learn together and support each other is also really important.
Yeah, I think we've seen that when we have had the opportunity to bring more than a couple of people in at once. That's definitely true, and certainly having improved our onboarding process a lot since we first started, like that sort of thing in combination works really well. I'm going to go to a question from Kush in the chat, who says a lot of hope is put into new hires. How have you found onboarding new hires has changed as you've scaled your organizations? Do you actually look at improving it? Do you let people fail to see how successful it is sometimes? How are you tracking it, and what would you do differently at different sizes given what you know now? So I guess this is the general question is, how have you found onboarding new hires has changed as you've scaled? Maybe Jo.
Right, yeah. So in And Digital, we kind of really took that plan, do, check, adapt cycle to every part of the business. Just as I was leaving, one of the things that we were working on was doing a much more data-driven view of our recruitment and onboarding lifecycle, looking from kind of right from that first engagement through to post probation period, first 6 months. And the things that we did in order to kind of make sure that actually we were getting the feedback cycles, between recruitment and the learning and development team and the hiring managers, was not easy, because again, it's like going back to that idea that you've got these different silos and nobody really understands each other's jobs, and you've got a bunch of hiring managers saying, why can't you just bring me more senior tech lead Black women in recruitment, going like, we are trying, honestly. So you've got a lot of people building understanding between those different parts of the recruitment and onboarding process. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to put hard figures against humans. And I'm not sure that we ever really kind of worked out how to make that properly data driven, or even if we, if that's something that you should be aiming to do. I don't know. Interested to hear others' experiences.
Sure. Sally, how about your perspective?
Yeah, so I was running the onboarding process at Deliveroo for a good time, actually. So, at a certain point we were hiring, there's nothing on the Google scale, obviously. We were hiring probably around 15 people every 2 weeks and onboarding them into the tech team. So it became kind of a pretty big operation, concerted effort. And I think one of the really interesting things about it was like looking in a kind of very calculated way at what we could gain from onboarding people efficiently. So we had around 25 sessions that we would use to onboard people every week, and those sessions range from what is the business doing to what do the teams do, how do we run product, what do our data science team do, what are our engineering principles, what are our kind of company values. And, if you kind of pay very careful attention, I think, to kind of making sure that, and how do we do code reviews, for example? So making sure that you've got this kind of golden opportunity at the beginning of somebody's journey in your company to kind of really instill in them the kind of practices and kind of cultures of the company. I think that's a kind of good starting point, right? And our engineers came in and didn't do anything else for anybody that started in the tech team didn't do anything else for the entire week. They didn't even really speak to their teams. So, kind of having that kind of great opportunity. And we did kind of track their kind of sentiments at the end of their first week, at the end of their kind of 4 weeks and 8 weeks, to try and figure out if they, had a kind of better understanding of their, of the company, of the team, of what they were working on, how many check-ins they'd had with their managers, kind of what their kind of NPS was for working in the company, all those sorts of things. So you can kind of use kind of data to drive whether you're doing a good job or not, I think, on onboarding. And the more you kind of concentrate everything around that first week, the less impact it has on your existing team, right? So the fewer questions your already extremely busy engineers and kind of tech teams have to ask in the second and kind of interim and kind of subsequent weeks, rather. So, kind of really seems like kind of a lot of effort to kind of create a big onboarding program for 1 week. And certainly a lot of people were involved. There were probably around, kind of 30 or 40 people involved in onboarding every 2 weeks. But it meant that everybody else in the kind of company could just basically get on with their jobs.
Yeah. Nigel, any thoughts on how your hiring process at Puppet has scaled?
I think the onboarding stuff is really, really critical. And one thing I was going to say was that we started doing a thing where the executive team rotated through being the person to sort of meet all the cohort and all deliver a common slide deck, but had to do it in a conversation with everyone, essentially in the room. And I think that was really useful when you're running at startup pace for you as a senior leader to step back and take that sort of time to meet new people. And it refreshes your own excitement, enthusiasm, because new people are excited. They're really happy to have joined the company. Some of them, it's their first startup. There's all this sort of positive energy going on there. And collaborating with, your first team of peers of going, well, what are the things that are important to get across to people? And rotating that through was super, super empowering. One thing I was going to say is we often, working with salespeople made me realize just how poorly we instrument this sort of stuff in engineering. Salespeople, productivity is measured. It is like you are closing this, money is coming in of a certain amount. And, good sales organizations measure the hell out of this stuff. It's like someone is hired, how long is it till they are a productive salesperson? Because it's such a lever for the senior leadership of the organization. Do we want more salespeople, fewer salespeople? It's all really metrics driven. So one of the things I tried experimenting with for a while was making more of a qualitative judgment around when is an engineer on board, and it's not that it's ever fully stopped, but getting people to sort of make that decision of how long is it taking us to get someone up to speed, but then treating that as an organizational failing if that's taking too long. It's not, you're not giving a black mark to the employee, but how do we actually fix those processes? And the one thing I'd always say to everyone is your onboarding, you should have an onboarding process for each team that the manager sets. And one of your jobs as someone being onboarded is to make a modification to that document, because there's always stuff that is out of date, particularly as you grow. And it gives the new team member a sense of ownership when someone else arrives 2 weeks later. There's an item on that list that they put onto that list that they felt was important. So that living document became really critical.
That's a really good point. I think we do that, and I think the fact that somebody can feel like they're making a difference very quickly, which is a bit difficult in a consultancy landscape sometimes, is useful. And also all of our documentation like that lives in Git, and so you have to have gone through the various kind of tooling that we use around everything else to do that. So yeah, really good. So we've got sort of a minute and a half left to go. I'm going to, because I think it's as useful to talk about the things that are going badly as they are going well. So if you're willing, Jo, what's the most heinous management mistake you've made, and how could we avoid it in future for ourselves? Really put you on the spot there.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. So every mistake I have made as a manager has come from good intentions that have been poorly enacted because I failed to put my own oxygen mask on first. And whether that's because I've been stressed at work or outside of work, or I've just kind of not actually given enough care or attention because I'm rushed. I think especially in these crazy COVID times, there's that kind of just, before you do anything, just take a breath and check yourself and take a step back.
Yep, good advice. Any similarly good advice, Sally?
Yeah, I think the worst mistakes I've ever made, of which there've probably been many, have been from not listening to people properly. And so, yeah, I think listen to people as much as you can. I've got a great story about this, but we've got 5 seconds, so you're not going to hear it.
Yeah, Nigel, your video was a bit crap earlier, but I think it's better now. Couple of seconds, your sage advice.
I think as you're growing, people will advocate for titles, and it may feel like titles are not important to you as a business, as a startup that's growing, but they're really important for individuals and their careers when they leave. And I think not recognizing that was some of the biggest mistakes I made.
Great. Well, thank you, panel. Thanks for joining. Nigel, Sally, Jo, great talking to you. Viewers, hope you've got something positive out of this.